live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about episode 2 of Star Trek, Charlie X. Now, there's a lot going on in Charlie X. Some of the social justice themes, I think, are more sort of incidental, not really that significant, but I do want to mention them anyway because we can see them. But then there's a couple of other things that I think are really important here. So basically what happens in Charlie X is the Enterprise gets this adolescent, 17-year-old named Charlie Evans. He was marooned on a largely desolate planet when his ship crashed when he was age 3 years old. No one else survived, but he managed to survive up to being 17. He was picked up by a ship called the Antares, which brought him to the Enterprise to take him to his surviving relatives on Colony 5. Initially, Charlie is just a sort of awkward kid, etc., etc. He's not socialized, etc., etc. But we progressively begin to see that he can do things with his mind. He has telekinesis. He's able to transmutate matter with his mind, etc., etc. And he slowly starts taking over the Enterprise. Much of what drives Charlie Evans is this need to be liked, but he doesn't know how to do that. He doesn't know how to be a proper member of society, and so his frustrations and the sometimes ridicule or rejection that he experiences from other people enrages him, and he uses his telekinetic abilities to make people disappear, or to turn them into iguanas, or to blank their faces, or take their voices, all these different kinds of things. Kirk largely manages to corral Charlie's behavior because Kirk stands up to him and refuses to show fear, and Charlie respects or fears or desires the approval of Kirk to such an extent that for much of the episode, when Kirk tells him to do something, he complies, even though we know, and Kirk is very much aware, that Charlie Evans has the ability to wipe Kirk out, wipe Kirk from existence just with a thought. stuff goes on, etc., etc. Charlie eventually basically takes over the entire ship, and then we have a kind of deus ex machina where the Thelosians, I think is the name of the planet. So the name of the species who once inhabited the planet, I think are called the Thelosians. The Thelosians come out into space, or one of them comes out into space anyway, and he projects his form onto the ship, and he's basically like, yeah, so we gave Charlie all these crazy fucking telekinetic abilities and whatnot so he would survive. Then we didn't actually realize he had gone until he left and destroyed the Antares and took out a bunch of your crew and stuff like that. Oops. Well, we've put your crew members back, so everybody survives, so that's good. And now, because Charlie will use his telekinetic abilities, and there's no way to prevent him from doing that, we're going to take him, because if we let him go with you and let him join human society, either he would destroy you, or you would have to destroy him in self-defense. So it's best that we just take him. From Charlie's perspective, this is a horrendous fate, which makes sense. I mean, basically, he is living by himself with non-corporeal energy beings. There's no physical interaction. There's no reciprocal emotional connections, things like this. Basically, he is in a kind of solitary confinement for his entire life, because that's the only place that he can survive without his telekinetic abilities being detrimental to those around him. So let's talk social justice here. So there's like I said, there's a couple of things that I think are relatively minor, things that we maybe would be reading into it, but that aren't necessarily huge concerns the episode itself is raising. The first is that Lieutenant Uhura sings. And that doesn't sound terrible in itself. And of course, later in the series, we learn that she enjoys singing for herself, if nothing else. But the fact that she's the only major African-American, that Nichelle Nichols is the only major African-American member of the crew. There's a number of African-Americans on the crew, a number of people who are not crew members, African-Americans who are in the show itself. But the fact that she's the only black character who plays a major role in the series was actually really, really, really important, and probably we'll talk about that later in this video series. But there's a long tradition of African Americans and Africans, enslaved Africans in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, colonized Africans in Africa itself, etc., etc., being associated with singing. Whether that's slave work songs or things like that, whether that's African-American spirituals, whether that's minstrel shows, things like this. The fact that the African-American actor is the only one who sings in the episode is potentially problematic, because it evokes these traditions in which often African-Americans, Africans in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, etc., etc., were coerced into singing for the entertainment of slave masters and things like this. Now, I don't think that's a serious issue. I don't think Star Trek in Charlie X was attempting to say, we've got Uhura and we're putting her into this minstrel role. But it is worth thinking about. It's also worth thinking about the content of her first song, which is about Spock. Leonard Nimoy, Jewish actor, who looks very stereotypically Jewish. Actually, the Vulcan salute is derived from Jewish tradition. The song that Uhura sings about Spock links him with the devil, It says that he is in Satan's guise, his devil ears and devil eyes. This theme of we know not what he'll do, this sort of danger, menace, etc., etc. Again, I don't think Star Trek is going for something overtly anti-Semitic here, but there is a long history of anti-Semitic associations between Jews and the devil, Jews and evil, etc., etc., in ways that are very, very problematic. So again, I don't think Star Trek is sort of going there purposefully, but it's worth thinking about the ways in which characters with distinct ethnic or racial backgrounds are represented. Now, the bigger issues. One of them is gendered interaction, and the other is ageism/disability. So in terms of the gendered interaction, Charlie very much develops a serious crush on Yeoman Janice Rand. This is problematic, but also interesting. It's problematic in the sense that Charlie, partially because he's not properly socialized, but also partially just because, more so in the 60s than today, patriarchal society. Charlie effectively behaves as though he has a right to Janice Rand's body. He has a right to come into her room. He has a right to talk to her, whether she wants to talk to him or not, etc., etc. All of this stuff is very standard patriarchal control of women type stuff, and it's extraordinarily problematic. The fact that that behavior is associated with Charlie, who becomes increasingly menacing over the course of the episode, is very interesting, because that suggests, to me at least, that Star Trek is taking a critical attitude of these patriarchal values. We also have some overtly anti-patriarchal, or more accurately, anti-sexual harassment elements to the episode. Charlie at one point sees one male crew member sort of backhand another on the ass, which, apparently people do. Not in my social circle, but I guess it's what you do. And so he thinks that's a sort of normal gesture of friendship, and so he later imitates that. He does the same thing to Janice Rand. And she is sort of embarrassed and unable to explain to him why that's inappropriate, so she sends him to Captain Kirk, who, of course, as we know, as people who've watched the rest of the series, is not necessarily super good in terms of explaining how to properly interact with women. But Kirk does have this line where he basically says, there's no right way to hit a woman. He does a shit job of explaining why what Charlie did was inappropriate, but he does have this line. There's no proper way to hit a woman. And on the one hand, that's very sexist, very patriarchal in terms of like, there are different standards of behavior, etc., etc. But at the same time, this is 1966. And that idea that, like, it's inappropriate particularly in a professional space, but anywhere, to sexually harass a woman, that's very progressive for 1966. I mean, if you went to any office in America, you would find executives and junior executives and whatever it is regularly sexually harassing the secretaries and things like that. Like, it was a standard part, unfortunately, of life at that time. And the fact that Star Trek takes a stand against that is very progressive, I think. The other element of this, which is really, I think, the central element of Charlie X, of the episode, is I think it's linked to disability studies, but it's most overtly linked to ageism. This idea that because Charlie is 17, he doesn't properly know how to behave, etc., etc. He's motivated by hormones. He's motivated by trying to figure out his place in the world, etc., etc. So there's that element there of ageism and the way that we conceptualize people's abilities, limitations, possibilities at different ages. But I actually think there's more of a disability studies element here, because Charlie is repeatedly unable to read and understand social cues. And that's a thing that's fairly common with people with autism. Now, I don't think that Charlie Evans has autism. There's no indication in the episode that he is autistic, but a lot of his behavior is reflective of the kinds of challenges that some people with autism experience. An inability to read social cues, an inability to understand how to properly respond in particular social situations, etc., etc. And Charlie himself even says this. Like, one of the concerns that he raises is, I want people to like me, but I don't know how to get them to like me. I always seem to be doing the wrong thing, and I don't know why. Now, that's very interesting. And I think here, whereas with the don't sexually harass women theme, I think Star Trek is very much in the right place here with the issue of, if we read this from a disability studies lens, and we see Charlie's behavior as similar to the experiences of many autistic people, I think we have rather a more complicated picture. Because on the one hand, Charlie is incredibly threatening throughout this episode. He has the ability to force compliance with his whims. I mean, again, he has telekinetic powers. He has the ability to make people disappear, to turn them into different things, etc., etc. And so in that sense, he is kind of a villain. And this is a problematic association, because people with autism are not villains. I mean, they can be conceptually, but by virtue of having autism, they are not. So that's a problematic association. I think, though, that the ending actually, in a way, redeems Charlie a little bit. When we find out that essentially he's lived this horrific existence of basically solitary confinement from age 3 to 17, that's psychologically devastating. I mean, we know that solitary confinement in prisons, for instance, even for short periods of time, is incredibly psychologically damaging and inhumane. And so we have that element of it. But I think if we read Charlie Evans as though he is a character on the autism spectrum, and he's cognitively or psychologically incapable of reading social cues in the way that social cues, in a way that society expects people to do, this raises interesting problems about the depiction of people with autism.